Like I'm sure some of you, when I first read the theme of this conference, All In on Grace, my thoughts went immediately to gambling. I'm going to go all in on this bet, but I have a problem with that theme, and my problem is simply this. I have so little experience with gambling personally that the closest I've really ever come to gambling was this one time our family ate dinner at a Steak and Shake restaurant that was located inside a Harrah's casino in Biloxi, Mississippi. And so we enjoyed discounted Steak and Shake burgers while surrounded by the depressing scene of retirees in America giving away their life savings one coin at a time at the casino. So I have no personal experience with gambling. So little, I don't even know what games you go all in on while you are playing. So I just want to say, Grant, thank you so much for this wonderful topic and theme. You know, this is a great softball, so I appreciate that. But whoever's selecting the theme for next year, Jeremy or somebody else, I just want to give you a few friendly encouragements. Maybe running with Christ, since my hobby is running, or maybe one saving from fire, since I'm a fire chaplain, or maybe we could have a conference in New Orleans and we could call it Hanging with Your Bros. Just spitballing a few ideas out there. But the question is, though, what does it mean to be all in on grace? Now, maybe I should have just simply asked Grant what he meant by all in on grace, but I didn't. So I'm thinking through what this means, and I'm thinking if I'm going to be all in on grace, if we're going to be all in on grace, I think what that would have to mean is that our goal is to give grace to everyone. Our goal should be that every single person is a recipient of the grace that we have received. You could also say that when it came to saving souls, Jesus pushed his chips all in on grace. So that means if I'm truly going to be all in on grace, if you're going to be all in, I think the only way to truly be all in on grace is to think through first all the individuals in our lives, all the groupings of people that we come into contact with, and then think to ourselves, who is that last person or who is that last group of people that I would want to give grace to? So when it comes to giving kindness, compassion, mercy, goodness, forgiveness, who are those people that I am least inclined to be gracious to? Who are those people that my knee-jerk reaction to them is, I'm going to hate you and I'm not going to be gracious to you? For some of you, it could be your neighbor who just keeps allowing their dog to poop in your front yard. For others, sadly, it could be your spouse, who you've had argument after argument after argument, and the hurt feelings have just been piling up over the years. I know for me, at one time in my life when I was working at Maine's Food and Party Warehouse, which is a grocery store in Binghamton, New York, I had this supervisor who for some reason took this sick pleasure in sort of tormenting the high school kids that worked there in the evenings, always bragging about all the women that he had slept with in his life. This guy just made it miserable for me to be there every time he was working. He would have been the last person on earth I ever wanted to give kindness to. So if you're truly going to be all in on grace, I think you need to start by saying, who is that last person I would give grace to? For some, it's the local abortionist. For others, it's that trans person in your life who always seems to be shoving their lifestyle right in your face, even if they're not intending to do that. So being all in on grace is giving grace, that's joy, peace, blessing to whoever that person is for you. So then the question for me came, who is the worst group of people in the Bible? Who are the people in the Bible that you would least expect to find grace in the Scripture? And can the way that those people are treated in the Bible help me know how to give grace to the people that I don't want to give grace to in my own life? The people that, if I'm honest with myself, these are the people that I just hate. And I think there's two groups of people in Scripture who are viewed so poorly today that even to this day, we use their title, their group's label, as an insult to speak of other people today. And those two most hated groups in the Bible, you have one in the Old Testament, one in the New. They are the Sodomites and the Pharisees. And since I've spent a lot of time in Genesis over the last year, I decided to go with Sodom. So to me, if God is all in on grace, we should expect that if we might not have been gracious in our words and our actions toward Sodom, God would have been. And then you have even the more crazy thing to think about. If God was gracious to the very people that he rained down fire and brimstone upon, would you then not say that God is going to be gracious to everyone if he was gracious to them? So what we're going to do now is we're going to fly through Genesis 13 through 19 to see how God treated the Sodomites before their destruction, to see all the ways that grace was offered up to them, to see if that can help us know how we can give grace to others in our own lives. So let's start with where the Sodomites lived in Genesis chapter 13, verse 10. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So the first thing we see here is that God gave the Sodomites the gift of living in a land that was well watered, a land that was described as being so beautiful, it was like the Garden of Eden. So these people, first and foremost, they had the joy, they had the blessing of waking up each and every morning with a land that was gorgeous, a land that had fresh spring water in the midst of their city walls. One of the things that I love about living in New Orleans is I like living in the South. I enjoy that warm weather. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about New Orleans is that if you look on the map where the lines of latitude are around the map, New Orleans is at the same line as Jerusalem and then most likely where Sodom was. And so New Orleans has similar weather to Sodom, except for there's one major difference. And that is the one thing that everybody in New Orleans hates about New Orleans weather is the humidity. As they will say, it's not the heat that'll kill you, it is the humidity. And the big difference between Jerusalem and Sodom in comparison to New Orleans is they have New Orleans weather, but with much decreased humidity. Like, it would have been an amazing place to live there. And then the question is, did the Sodomites do any work to give themselves the land where they were located? Did they navigate the waters of the Jordan so that they would flow beside where their city was located? Did they place the freshwater springs that were located inside their city walls? No. It was all the grace of God. So the first thing that we learn about Sodom, the very first thing that Scripture tells us about it, is that God was gracious to that valley. And so grace begins, I think, with the simplicity we see of the beauty of God's creation, the simplicity of giving gifts of cold water to someone who's in need, holding out that helping hand to someone who needs a lift, and also remembering that God did not reserve his refreshing water, his beautiful sunshine for the righteous. And we should not reserve our charity for the deserving as well, but we should give it to both the deserving and undeserving alike. So the first thing we read about Sodom was that God blessed them by giving them a beautiful place to live. And the second thing we learn about Sodom was that God gave grace to Sodom by sending them Lot. Look at Genesis 13, 11 to 13. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinners against the Lord. Now, I don't know about you, whenever I read these verses or I've been taught it in church before, the focus is always the negative influence that Sodom would have upon Lot. But have we ever considered that God was actually being gracious to Sodom by sending Sodom Lot? Sodom was on the path to destruction. We see that Sodom was on the path to destruction both in the prophecy that the city would be destroyed in verse 10 and then their exceedingly wicked character in verse 13. And what does God do in that time between the declaration of their wickedness and when the fires of judgment will actually fall? What does God do in that time period? He sends them righteous Lot. And it's not me who decided to call Lot righteous Lot. That was Peter. You see, at this time period, Abraham, he had to stay in the promised land. Abraham had to be there due to the covenant that God had established with him. So who else was there to send to Sodom in order to give grace to them and warn them before the coming judgment? The only person left to send was Lot. And so while we could view Lot traveling to Sodom from the perspective of, oh no, those heathens will corrupt poor Lot. Oh, look at how awful it is that he moved nearby this city of Sodom. But we could also look at it from the perspective of God is giving the people of that city one final witness of righteousness before their end. Now, we know he wasn't effective, but let's be honest. I mean, one of the calling cards of a lot of prophets and witnesses in the Old Testament was that they weren't very effective. Jeremiah was not able to turn the hearts of the city of Jerusalem back to the Lord as well. Sending Lot to Sodom actually reminded me of a quote I read by Joe Duke earlier this year. You'll never fully appreciate God's plan of grace until you embrace a profound reality. God is not afraid to waste his love. God was not afraid to waste his love by sending Lot to Sodom before their destruction. God is not afraid to waste his love on your neighbors, your family members, those annoying coworkers by sending you to them again and again and again and again, even while they reject his grace and his gospel. You see, you and me, we all, like Lot, have the opportunity to be that grace to those people who are on the path to destruction. And at that point where someone appears to be beyond the hope of a witness for the gospel, their heart is just too hard. Maybe they've rejected your acts of kindness a dozen times before. I would encourage you to reach out to them again, even if it may appear to you that it would be a waste. So when you have your neighbor who wants to scream at you every time you step a toe on their yard, or your kids run out onto their yard, and all of a sudden that neighbor breaks his hip, you be the first person to step up over there to mow their lawn for them when they're unable to do it themselves, knowing all the while that your kindness could very well be spit upon. Their view of your grace is not an excuse to withhold grace from them. And then our next engagement with Sodom after chapter 13 comes in the very next chapter, in Genesis chapter 14. In Genesis 14, we find what I would call an ancient mob boss by the name of Chedorlaomer. And Chedorlaomer and his cronies, they come to the conclusion that they have not been getting their protection money from the people who live in the Jordan Valley recently. So they go in there and they rush into the Jordan Valley so that they can rough up a few people that are living in that area, and they can get their money from Sodom and Gomorrah that they have been withholding from them. And so Chedorlaomer and the kings that are with him, they ride down into the Jordan Valley. The Sodomites have what may have ended up being the worst battle strategy in all of history. We read that they went to hide out in the asphalt pits that were near them. I'm going to assume that their guess was, we're going to go near the asphalt pits and our enemies will fall into them. But instead we read that it was the Sodomites who fell into the asphalt trips. So they probably fell into their very own trap. And then Chedorlaomer is able to take the people and the possessions of Sodom as captives and as booty and run off with them back to their home, which was in the ancient area of Babylon. But before they can get out of the land of Canaan as they're heading off to the north, who comes to Sodom's rescue? Who comes to Sodom's rescue but none other than the very man blessed by God. You see, God had already promised that his blessing would cover not only Abraham, but his blessing would cover everyone whom Abraham also blessed as well. And so while Abraham is running off to save Sodom, we see that the blessing on Abraham ends up being able to extend to the Sodomites in what Abraham does for them. Genesis 14, 15, and 16 read, "He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods, and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people." So there's one important thing I want to note here about this victory by Abraham. And that is, at this point in the narrative, because of the victory that Abraham had over Chedorlaomer, because of the deliverance that he had given to the city of Sodom, at this point, if Abraham desired to, if he wanted to, he could have become the warlord over Sodom. There was really nothing in Abraham's way at this moment from saying to the Sodomites, "You and all you have are my spoils from war. I have won you. You serve me now. I am your conqueror." But since Abraham was to be a blessing, we need to remember the real critical phrase, the central phrase in the call of Abraham in Genesis 12, 2 and 3. The central phrase is, "And you shall be a blessing." That's the middle phrase in there. And this phrase, "and you shall be a blessing," this wasn't a promise that was made to Abraham, that if you go, God will enable you to be a blessing. This was actually written as a command. Abraham was commanded to be a blessing. And so this chapter, this section, is Abraham being obedient to the command of God and him giving grace to Sodom. And I believe by giving grace to Sodom, Abraham also protects himself from the wickedness of Sodom at the same time. Because we read in verses 22 and 23, Abraham said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich." And this brings out an interesting side note, that while we're working to give grace to those who are the farthest from God, far from being infected by the sins of others in some way, I believe the grace of God working through us to give grace to sinners in need will actually protect us from the wickedness of the world and the wickedness of those in need of grace. Abraham, by the strength of God, was able to stare down all of the riches of Sodom and turn them away. I doubt that if Abraham had not previously been active in grace, if he would have been powerful, if he would have been strong enough to maintain such a merciful spirit toward Sodom and also a protective spirit for his own soul. Grace to the wicked has this almost cauterizing effect, you could say, an ability to protect our own hearts from the draw of evil in this world. One of the things I'm most tempted about in life personally is in the sin that I think we're all tempted in today, and that is the sin of envy, to be envious. And what I am most tempted to be envious regarding is my car, my automobile. You see, I don't own a nice car. I have a 2006 Saturn Ion. My car's small. It has a host of problems. It even has a lot of really odd problems. Like in order to turn off the overhead lights in the car and the radio, after I've turned the car off, I need to open the passenger door and then shut it in order to turn the radio off. And when I turn my car off, I can't pull the keys out until I first push this button inside the steering column. And then also my daytime running lights died, and I went to go get a bulb to replace my daytime running lights. But you know what they don't make anymore? Saturns. So they don't make my daytime running bulbs anymore for the car. So just got all these really odd problems in this vehicle. And every time someone in my life comes up to me and they're like, Shawn, I just got a new car. And they show me their new car and their new truck. Like a part of me is like, oh, I'm so happy for you. Like, you got this new car. That's so wonderful. I love that you got this new automobile. But then there's another part of me that's like, kind of dying inside, like, yeah, I got to keep driving my 2006 Saturn, and like, this is not fun. And so people have come up to me and been like, Shawn, well, then why don't you just go out and get a new car? And the reason I don't end up replacing my car is because inevitably I will end up driving someone who doesn't own a car to the Dollar Tree or to Walgreens or to the hospital. And after driving someone who doesn't have the money to afford an automobile somewhere, at the end of that drive, I'm always like, you know what, Saturn? That's a pretty nice car. I like my car because it's a million times better than not having a car. And by helping other people who are in need, it protects me from my own envy. It protects me from going into debt to purchase a car that I cannot afford to have. And giving grace to others on a consistent basis, I believe it protected Abraham from longing and grasping for what others had that he was not intended to have. It protects me from being envious toward others for all the gifts and the grace that God has given to me. So giving grace to others is not only beneficial for those who receive your grace, but it is also immensely beneficial for the one who is giving grace themselves. And let's be honest, I can look around this room and I know all of you struggle with envy, greed, lust, fear. Those emotions inside of us, those sins, they can just burn so hard. They can just churn up a storm inside of us. And so if we just want to quiet those storms. Like if I could just get rid of those internal sins, oh man. And I think the greatest way to calm those storms is to find ways to give of yourself to others who are in need. Give of your finances to those who do not have. Give of your time to those who are alone. Give of your knowledge. Give of your skills. And as you're gracious to others, you will find that through the grace that you give to others, it will drive out those internal struggles with sin and selfishness that we all possess inside our lives. So let's note what we've had happen so far in the narrative with our interactions with Sodom. So far in Genesis chapter 14, we are to the point where Abraham is about 85 years old, give or take. And we're not going to come across Sodom for another 15 years, which will be in Genesis 18 and 19. But how have the interactions been with Sodom so far? Well, the first thing we see about Sodom is that it is very wicked. Exceedingly wicked, it says, no less. I'd imagine that for some of you in here, probably every time during this message when I say sodomite, you're probably going to cringe a little bit thinking about that sin and those who suffer from it and live with it today. And that really shows us how we view that city today. That's what their reputation is. But what has the Lord actually done to or Sodom at this point in the narrative until we get to chapter 18? So far in the narrative, far from being an adversary against Sodom, or even God just being like, these people are wicked and I'm just going to give them the cold shoulder, everything that God has done for Sodom so far has been gracious. It's been good. What does he bless them with in the land where they live? They have beautiful water. They have green fields. He then blessed them by sending them one of the rare households of righteousness and faith who worshiped the Lord in those days. And then when the Sodomites become entangled with foreign warlords, what does the Lord do? Does he leave them to fend on their own? No, he sends Abraham to deliver them from their own misery. And God not only sends Abraham to deliver them, but Abraham double blesses them. First, by delivering them from Chedorlaomer, but then second, by refusing to enrich himself off of their wealth. So far, God has done nothing but be gracious to Sodom. He has done nothing but be good to them. So in the years leading up to their destruction, we don't find this image of God as if he was sitting up in heaven being like, oh, I'm counting down the days until I can send that fire down to destroy the Sodomites. Those people are just the worst. But every interaction we have with God and Sodom, it is God being gracious to them. But as the day approached for judgment, as 15 years passed by, and we get to that final day of destruction, in the days leading up ahead, what God proves is that he's not done with grace. But God goes even farther than I think anyone would have predicted with grace. So the Lord meets with Abraham at the beginning of Genesis chapter 18, and Genesis 18 is just this glorious account of friendship, good eating. You have the icing on the cake of a baby announcement in the midst of all of it. It's just so wonderful. And then at the end of that glorious meeting together, that eating of food where they're stuffed and full, Abraham walks with the Lord outside of his camp. It's Abraham, the Lord, and two of his angels. And as the Lord looks toward Sodom, we read the following in Genesis 18, 17 and 19. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. For I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him." Now, some scholars say that the Lord was speaking these words to himself. I believe the Lord was speaking these words to the angels who were with him. And the reason I believe he was doing this is because I think the purpose of these verses is that the Lord is trying to goad Abraham into action. He's trying to push Abraham through these words into having Abraham join God in the doing of righteousness and justice. You see, this was Abraham's chance. This was his opportunity to be part of God's righteousness. Abraham will end up repeating the words of the Lord right back to him when he prays to God in the following verses, which leads me to say that Abraham's just following God's own words. And he's saying, God, I'm trying to be just, and I want you to be just like you said. So note, the Lord said he wanted to bring Abraham in on his righteousness and justice. And then in verse 25 we read, "Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" So this prayer was all about Abraham walking in God's righteousness and Abraham wanting God to walk in God's righteousness. So this is joining God in justice. So mind you, this is justice. This is righteousness. And then what does Abraham pray about? Look at verses 23 to 25. Abraham came near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you indeed sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" So Abraham prays about justice. He prays about righteousness. But what really was his concern throughout this prayer? His concern's really about mercy and grace. It's about God not dealing judgment upon those who were not deserving of the judgment. And what I love about this is that Abraham is just going to really drill down deep into this grace of a just condemnation upon the city. Because Abraham's going to say, well, if you're going to save it for 50, can't you save it for 45? And if you're going to save it for 45, can't you save it for 40? And if you're going to save it for 40, can't you save it for 30? And if you're going to save it for 30, can't you save it for 20? And Lord, just please don't be angry about me for asking yet again. But if you're going to save it for 20 people, won't you save the entire city if there are 10 righteous in it? Abraham was pleading with God in prayer to save and be merciful to the Sodomites on behalf of only 10 righteous in the city. So I want to notice what happens here. God wants Abraham to join him in doing righteousness and doing justice. And how does Abraham respond in prayer? We might think righteousness and justice would be like, God, look at all the terrible things the Sodomites have done. You must destroy them. But instead, when Abraham talks about righteousness and judgment, he responds by praying for grace and mercy. So what does that teach us? That when we go all in on grace, what then happens to our sense of righteousness and our understanding of justice? Even our righteousness ends up being bent like a tree that is being blown over to the side by hurricane-force winds of God's strong influence of grace. This is such a wonderful interaction because back in Genesis chapter 12, when God told Abraham to go into this foreign land, the end result of Abraham going into this land was that Abraham was to be a blessing there. And here we are years later. Abraham's told fiery judgments are going to fall on people in this region where you were sent to, Abraham. And what does Abraham do? In wonderful obedience, he prays to God that God would show grace and mercy to the people who are surrounding him. I think we get the story of Sodom terribly wrong in the church. This is not a story that focuses on God's wrath. This is a story that focuses on God's grace. Because before the destruction, God surrounded Sodom with grace. On the wonderful announcement when Sarah was told, you're going to have a son and he's going to be Isaac, what did the end of Isaac's birth announcement have attached to it? Prayer for mercy for the people of Sodom. We can't truly be all in on grace. And the interesting thing is, we can't truly be all in on righteousness. We can't truly be all in on justice until we first label the Sodomites who are in our lives. Who are the people that you despise? Who are the people that because of their sinful influence on your community, on our nation, that you would like to see God send the fires down upon them because of how they've been living and the sins that they have been drawing people into? How would God want you to give righteousness to those people? God would want you to give them righteousness by praying for mercy to come to them. So who are the families? Who are the neighbors that, if you're honest, you just wish they would drop dead? And maybe if you're kind, like, I don't want them to drop dead, maybe just leave for another part of the country and move away. Because they're nothing more than a drain on your spirit, your time, your energy. You are to give righteousness to them, not by cursing their names, but by uplifting their name before your Father in heaven. Grace isn't easy. And I think the biggest reason that grace isn't easy because it calls on us to be good regardless of the goodness of others in our lives. It calls on us to be loving regardless of the ability of others to respond to our love with love that they give back to us in return. But now this leads us to our two final forms of grace. Two that must go together, because if you don't have the first, you will abuse the last form of grace. As grace seen in Genesis chapter 19 will combine both intimacy and judgment. So the majority of Genesis chapter 19 covers the time that the angels spend in the city of Sodom. First, the angels arrive in Sodom, and their desire is they want to spend the night in the city square so that they can observe the entire city. But Lot, the righteous Lot that he is, lets them know they should not spend the night in the town square. But Lot invites them to come into his own home. And as they come into Lot's home, Lot that evening, he gives them a very underwhelming feast of unleavened bread. I actually had to read that several times when I was preaching through this, when I saw that Lot gave them a feast, and it says he went and got the unleavened bread. I don't know about you, but if I went over to somebody's house and they're like, Shawn, we're going to have a feast, and then they're like, here's a plate of matzah, I'd be like, where's the feast? Because unleavened bread is not a feast. But that's all he had to give to the angels. And after their very underwhelming feast, the men of Sodom start pounding on Lot's door. They insist on doing heinous and terrible acts with the angels who are there. But the angels are able to blind the crowd. They're able to escort Lot and his wife and his daughters out of the city. Not only do they escort Lot and his daughters and his wife out of the city, but they also offer to give protection to Lot's future son-in-laws. But when they go to make that offer to Lot's future son-in-laws, they're like, nah, it'll be all right. We'll just stay here. And which the narrator says it was not all right for them to stay here. Now, what is the significance of all this when it comes to grace? And from our perspective of grace. And that is grace gets its hands dirty. Grace is personal. Grace is face to face. Did God know of the depravity of Sodom before he sent his angels to that city? Of course he did. We knew about it way back in Genesis chapter 13 when we read it way back there. God did not need to send the angels there. He's omniscient. But since God is gracious, and since grace requires us to get close and personal to those who are in need, God sends his angels right into the midst of Sodom. See, one thing God knows, along with everything else it's possible to know, is that grace doesn't work from long distance. Jesus came from heaven to earth to be our Savior in the greatest act of grace in all of human history. And then before Jesus' ascension, he doesn't go up to his disciples and be like, all right, I need you to make this Christian commune and all live together outside of Jerusalem. He says, no, I need you to go and make disciples. And then when Jesus was personally here on earth, what do we find Jesus doing? We find Jesus touching the lepers. We find Jesus spitting into the dirt and making mud with his fingers. He personally divided the fish, divided the bread before it was passed out to the 5,000. When he heard that Lazarus was sick and at the point of death, he went and traveled to Bethany himself because grace is personal. So what did God do before the judgment of Sodom? He got personal. Think about the grace it was for the angels to come to Sodom, and from the angels' perspective, they already know what's going on in Sodom. But for the fact that they would show up at the city and then say to Lot, no, bro, we're gonna stay in this town square. Like we want to make sure that we get everything that's going on right here. It was the angels who told Lot, go get your sons-in-law. That wasn't Lot's idea, it was the angels' idea. They were working intimately to give grace to everyone they could. So we see that grace and mercy requires us to get into people's lives. To fish with fishermen, hunt with hunters, run with runners, drink coffee with coffee snobs, and sit with the lonely and the weeping. And look, I know getting into people's lives can be really hard right now. I feel like the more technology we get in our lives, the harder it is to be up close and personal with other people. And like, I get it. Like I am a reader. I hate to say it, but out of everybody in this conference, probably other than my wife and my kids, I probably love my books more than I love all of you that are in here. If we were to have an introvert contest, I could probably get up toward the top and maybe win that contest with everybody else here. So I knew I needed to do something to get into the lives of other people. So I volunteered to be the fire chaplain in our local community because being a fire chaplain, you get those 911 calls and it kicks my butt to get out of the office and to get into lives with other people and to stand with them in their hour of need. And some of you in here, I say this in the most gracious way possible, but you may need something in your life to kick your butt, to get you out there, to get personal, face-to-face, hand-to-hand with those who are in the world. You see, God is not looking for more silent donors. God is looking for people who will hold hands, kiss foreheads, hug people through the tears, laugh with them in their victories, eat together with joy. Grace gets personal in the best of times and in the worst of times. And then once we've gotten personal with those who are in need of grace, we can finally come to the last form of grace in this story, and that is grace in judgment. I believe the fires that fell on Sodom was the final grace given to that city. We have a city that was so overcome with depravity and lust and violence and greed. It was a city that was most likely the center for pagan worship in the region. And so the point had come that for the sake of not only the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, but probably for the people of the entire Jordan Valley, that the city needed to be removed. And God did so quickly, and God did so mercifully with fire from heaven. And this reminds us something that we can never forget, and that is the least gracious thing we can do, the least merciful thing we can do, is to encourage other people in their sinful ways of life, or to overlook the sins that we see in the lives of others that we know are destroying their lives. Sin cripples souls. Sin ruins lives. Sin tears families apart. Sin mocks the glory and wonder of the name of our Creator. Judgment is grace. And I believe our role today in the church is that we are to be patient and we are to wait for the coming judgment at the return of Jesus Christ. Today, we take that wrath just like Abraham did and we reserve the wrath for God. So right now, we need to have two prayers at the same time. One, a prayer for God to be merciful, that those who are far from Him, to those who don't know Jesus Christ could come to believe in him during this time, but then also a prayer for God to bring that merciful judgment, to bring that wrath at the second coming of Jesus Christ when he establishes his kingdom on earth. But while we wait on the coming of Christ, during this time period, we have a role where maybe sometimes we feel like Lot. And that is we're calling on the world to come to Christ and to believe in him, to not rest in the security of their sins, but to instead rest in the light of Jesus Christ. And some of us may have that role of Lot, where the only people who get out of the fires are us and our families. But as Joe said, God's not afraid to waste his love on those who are in need. You know, think about this. This in some way I think is probably the craziest message I have ever preached and taught. So when I was thinking about what to talk about with All In on Grace, I had sort of settled on this idea, like I'm going to talk about all the ways that God gave grace to Sodom and the Sodomites. And I'd really settled on this, and then, how the timing works out, with the Lord, like right after I'd totally settled, this is definitely what I'm going to do, I get a phone call from Jeremy Vance. And Jeremy calls me, and we're talking about the conference, and Jeremy's like, Shawn, what are you going to speak at for the conference? And as soon as he asked me that question, I kind of have this moment of panic, like, oh no, I'm going to have to tell him what I'm talking about. And so I'm like, well, Jeremy, I'm going to talk about all the ways that God gave grace to the Sodomites. And so I say that, and there is this long pause. Like 30 seconds of dead air on the phone, and I'm just thinking, oh, this idea is worse than I thought it was. And Jeremy's like, no, I'm just taking it in. Yeah, because you think it's crazy. And I kind of hope it's crazy. Like, I hope this is just an insane thing. Like, we sat here and talked about all the ways that God gave grace to Sodom. And I hope one thing you take away from is, I never noticed all the ways God was gracious to Sodom. It's true, in every encounter up until the fires fell, God was good and gracious and kind and merciful and delivering to them. And I hope that when you think about that when you leave here, it'll then jog you to think, okay, who are Sodom in my life? Who are my Sodomites? And how can I make a commitment in my daily interactions to be gracious and merciful to them instead of callous and indifferent or even bringing hatred toward them? And one of the wonderful things about this passage and all the ways that God gave grace to Sodom is that, in my opinion, the ultimate, like the great form of grace is seen in the prayer that Abraham has. I mean, one, that prayer is long. Like, that takes up a long record as far as, narrative passages in Scripture. And it's all about Abraham praying for these people. So you can start off in the very basic way of saying, all right, I'm going to begin to pray for them. I'm going to pray that God will be merciful, he'll be gracious, he'll be long-suffering, that they'll believe the gospel. And I believe that once we begin to pray for these individuals, then that will then change our lives in all the ways we interact with them, so that we can bring all the different ways that God was gracious to the Sodomites into our interactions with others. So when I think of being all in on grace, this is what I think of: God giving grace to the Sodomites, and I hope that it will encourage you to give grace to those that you would naturally not give grace to in your own lives.